Hello! Today we're going to be comparing 3 games in the asymmetrical horror genre. Those being Dead by Daylight, Evil Dead the Game, and Video Horror Society. First we're going to summarise the gameplay of each title before looking at their strengths and weaknesses when it comes to their design. To do this we are going to analyse 6 categories of design. Balance, comparing how fair each game's design is. Graphics, discussing graphical styles and colour theory. User interfaces, focusing on user experience and informational architecture. Level design, which will relate to the world building and how the environment supports the gameplay. Community, discussing communication in each game and the player base as a whole. And finally, which I find the most fun. I love asymmetrical horror games. Dead by Daylight and Resident Evil Resistance really brought me into loving the genre, and since then, many others have appeared on the scene. Of those though, to me it feels like DBD, Evil Dead the Game, and Video Horror Society have really captured strong audiences. DBD has reigned supreme over the genre for the last 6 years. What's always been interesting though is every time a new game is announced of this genre, many flock to describe it as the game to knock DBD off the top. It's this idea that made me want to make this video, and we'll touch on that specific topic later on. But let's start by taking a look at DBD and its biggest competitors, and discuss their core gameplay. We've gone into a lot of detail about what makes Dead by Daylight so fun in a past video, so I'll do my best to summarise it. The game features one unstoppable killer player, taking on 4 survivors who seek to repair 5 generators to open a door and escape. The survivors have 3 health states, and lose them through being hooked by the killer. The killer player seeks to protect and defend the generators, hook survivors, and overall prevent escape. This is the gameplay loop present in each match, and they must engage with it to win. Survivors have a mirrored loop of repairing the generators, evading the killer's grasp, and escaping the match through the door or hatch. Each match features random generation, changing available pallets, vaults, and loops. This, along with the survivor perk choices, killer's abilities, and their chosen perks, make for a unique experience every round. The beauty of this game's design is the looping mechanic, of survivors being chased by killers and this feeling of uncertainty. You never really know what's going to happen. Evil Dead the Game's core gameplay loop differs from this. Rather than a killer, the game features a demon player who tries to overwhelm and defeat 4 weapon-wielding survivors. The demon spawns deadites into the world to fight for them. They're more of an omnipotent entity watching the gameplay for the most part, setting up traps and occasionally taking direct control of units to engage in combat themselves. The survivor players on the other hand utilise melee and ranged weapons they collect to fight back, somewhat reminiscent of gameplay from Left 4 Dead and Back 4 Blood. From the demon's perspective, they must gather infernal energy, summon deadites to knock down the survivors, and prevent the Book of the Dead's completion. Survivors have an entirely different loop. They must complete objectives such as collecting map pieces, the Kandari dagger, and book pages, then defend themselves and fight off the forces of evil, and finally they seek to rebuild the Book of the Dead and seal away the evil. Essentially the 2 sides play very differently. Evil Dead the Game features health bars, shields, stats, and damage numbers. So unlike DBD, where loops are at its core, direct combat is the focus for Evil Dead the Game, making for a somewhat chaotic and exciting match every time. And now for Video Horror Society, VHS for short. It's probably worth noting this game is still in closed beta as of this video being published, but enough of the game is playable for us to get a good feeling for its design. Like the other 2, this game features 2 opposing sides, the monster player and the team of 4 teens. In this game, both sides seek to defeat the other through combat. Teens must craft 4 weapon types and strike the monster down with each of them to win. The monster must defeat the teens before they are injured by all 4 weapon types. The monster player's core loop is to protect the weapon crafting stations, seek out and hunt down the teens by striking them, and hide when targeted with said weapons. Teen players have an entirely mirrored loop of constructing weapons at the crafting station, hiding from the monster when defenseless, and hunting when their weapons have been crafted. Monsters have specific abilities such as the Shielding Wart, Howling Werewolf, and the Doll Controlling Doll Master. Their main goal is to hit and damage the teens, knocking them to the ground enough times for them to die. The game also supports the use of in-game microphones for the teen players so they can coordinate and defeat the monster with their various weapons. Though all 3 are similar in terms of being 4v1, each feels unique. DBD features some stealth, but most of the game revolves around being chased or chasing. VHS, like DBD, has some stealth elements, but rather than chases, focuses on combat and communication. Evil Dead is the most unique of the three, being almost solely about direct combat with the other side. All three have clear gameplay loops, and although are all asymmetrical horror games, and regardless of some similarities they have, they all feel like entirely different games. So now that we have a rough outline for the games themselves, let's start analysing their designs. First off, how fair are they? As with the topic of gameplay, I have discussed the balance of DBD a little bit in the past, but I will give it a bit of a recap. But for even more detail, you can watch the previous video. Anyway, asymmetrical games are very difficult to balance because of opposing goals and abilities that each side has. The biggest controversy of asymmetric game is whether it can achieve the fairness of the opposing sides under the initial unbalanced setting conditions. Essentially, it's very difficult to make an asymmetrical game fair. For example, a killer in DBD has to mind game and play around a loop very differently to a survivor with very different tools at their disposal. This is where the meta forms. Dead Hard is a great example of a perk which is easy to use and counters almost any good play by a killer. If you're an M1 killer in DBD, there's really nothing you can do against a Dead Hard except lose 2 to 3 gens in that first chase. This is why increasingly at higher MMR you see more nurses and blights who are less affected by such perks and have various other balancing issues in the game. On top of this, DBD features a lack of symmetry in its map design. The existence of randomly generated tiles can result in almost diabolical loops or total dead zones for the survivors. The RNG makes balance very difficult to control. Then you have to take into account matchmaking. DBD does feature an MMR system to match players of similar skill sets together, but this is far from perfect. So generally doesn't have the best balance. But if you don't see it as a competitive game, which I personally don't, then who really cares? But the point remains, DBD can sometimes feel very unfair for both sides. Evil Dead the game is another fine example of the difficulties of balancing an asymmetrical game. How close survivors are to the 3 map pieces at the start, along with how close the dagger and book pages spawn together, can dramatically affect the early to mid game. How much pink F the survivors are able to locate can adjust their combat potential. Also, where the demon initially spawns can affect how quickly they can defend key locations, or even locate the survivors. All of these factors can drastically affect the start of the match. Despite this, Evil Dead does feel like it gives the players a lot of chances to come back on both sides. The matches have enough length that rarely is it over in the early stages, so even if one side has a less than perfect start, the match can still turn in your favour later on. The environments themselves are not symmetrical in any sense, but this is admittedly less important with this style of game. Some areas of the in-game world are better for survivors, and some are better for specific demons, but we'll discuss this in more detail later on. There is also a lack of matchmaking, where a high level experienced player can be matched with lower level new players. But the game is still fairly new, and this may well be changed in the future. So certainly there is some balance issues with the game, but if it's one thing I've learned from playing Evil Dead the game, it's never really over till it's over. Video Horror Society is maybe a finer example of asymmetrical balancing. I think a lot of it is due to the core loops which we discussed in chapter 1. Both sides have distinctively similar playstyles. Outside of crafting weapons by the teens, both sides play similar, hunting and hiding from one another. Each monster has perks to give them a chance against the outnumbering teens, and the game has quite a good amount of back and forth. Fairness or equality is an essential component of games, and I think VHS has done a great job of achieving this in an asymmetrical setting. Because both sides have essentially mirrored goals, it leads to an easier time balancing. Both the teens and monster have multiple damage stages and damage each other in similar ways. Monster's abilities feel like they allow them to play around the coordination of the teens and ultimately feels quite fair in most cases. The levels are also mostly fine. We'll speak more of these later on in the video, but some areas are better for the teens to ambush the monster than others, and some sections allow the monster to hide and evade damage easier, generally pretty well balanced. Though one thing is there doesn't appear to be any form of matchmaking system as of yet. The game certainly feels more competitive than the others and has some very dedicated users. Newer players being thrown against these long-time players is an issue, but the game is still in closed beta. Hopefully they plan to change this and add a matchmaking system in the future, as this is probably the main issue with the game's balancing. Because of the way you upgrade and level your characters, even simply having more time in the game gives you a strong advantage outside of your developed skill. Though if we focus on the game's mechanics alone rather than the lack of matchmaking, VHS is probably the strongest of the three in terms of fairness. Video game graphics come in a multitude of styles, the main three being abstract, realistic, and stylized. Abstract applies to games which feature geometrical shapes such as Super Hexagon and Geometry Dash, but this one isn't applicable to our focus today. Realistic attempts to mimic real life, and Evil Dead the game fits into this category. Characters mimic their real life counterparts and the world is very high fidelity. Everything is proportioned like real life and the world is populated by small details that make it feel real. Dead by Daylight also attempts to mimic realistic character proportions and leans towards this realistic style. Although DBD could be argued to have some stylized elements, I would suggest that it comes across more lower fidelity than it does stylized. The game still looks great, and honestly the simplicity of the world works well, as being able to quickly identify and understand your environment is important when making split-second decisions in a chase. Finally, there is stylized, which can be further broken down into exaggerated, where for example characters have larger features like in Overwatch, and minimalist, which tends to avoid smaller details like seen in games like Journey. Video Horror Society has an exaggerated style, with characters having larger eyes, the world having excessively proportioned assets, and so on, making it stand out from the other two. A possible reason for this is, both Evil Dead and Dead by Daylight are rated for ages 18+, and along with a more realistic style they are able to provide more gore. Blood is a core part of Dead by Daylight's gameplay, and Evil Dead being a franchise well known for its gruesome scenes. VHS currently has no age rating. Instead of blood, the teen characters leave colourful patches of videotape-like patterns, and tape extrudes from their bodies when injured. The exaggerated cartoon style is lent into fully. This leads us to my next topic, colour theory. Colour theory is the idea that certain colours have logical structures and work well with other colours, and have meaning. For example, red in Western cultures representing danger. Singh in 2006 suggested, people decide whether or not they like something within 90 seconds or less. Somewhere between 62 and 90% of that assessment is based on colour alone. So colour can be a very powerful tool. Dead by Daylight and Evil Dead the game both have very muted colour palettes, relying on duller tones, whereas Video Horror Society features very vibrant tones with lots of bright colours. The reason that we see this stark difference is likely because of different target markets and desired age ratings. DBD and Evil Dead are fully released priced games. Their more realistic graphic style and their more gory tones lean towards a more mature audience. In contrast to this, VHS will be free to play, and everything about its graphics suggests it leans towards a younger audience. Some similarities between its art style and colour palette can be drawn between it and Fortnite, for example. VHS also features playable characters who are teenagers, which again suggests its target market being of a lower age demographic, whereas Evil Dead and DBD feature adult characters. As a result, for me personally, I believe graphically speaking Evil Dead the game is the strongest. It's the highest fidelity and the horror genre tends to attract a more mature audience, so its style is perfect. Dead by Daylight is slightly lower graphically, but I honestly think for its game design it makes it easier to recognise affordances and use the environment during loops. For me the weakest is unfortunately VHS. I think I'm just not its target market. The playable characters being teens makes them very difficult to like, and the art style feels sometimes a little childish. But it will appeal to a younger audience, and its free-to-play model is likely a reason for this direction. But graphics certainly aren't everything, so let's discuss the game's environments and world building. Lore/world building is the concept of fleshing out a setting beyond just that of the initial concept. It's about building a sense of place that transcends the original concept or plot. All three of our games have some basis in explicit storytelling, meaning the narratives are stated clearly and in detail, leaving no room for confusion or doubt. Dead by Daylight has some text-based lore in the archives and character descriptions along with some video packages which explain the backgrounds of both survivors and killers. Evil Dead the game somewhat relies on prior knowledge of the franchise. There's very little detail about the characters outside of their character dialogue when playing the game. It does make clear what is going on though with descriptions from Professor Raymond Noby or Linda. Video Horror Society will likely have some explicit detailed lore for their characters as well, but in the closed beta this option is currently unavailable as they dot the I's and cross the T's. So this can give us some idea of the world, but I don't believe explicit storytelling is the most interesting way to world build. What about implicit storytelling? What I mean by this is suggested, though not directly expressed. So this is when you can piece together a narrative through good world building in the environment itself. Dead by Daylight has some good examples of this. One example is Autohaven. This realm is dedicated to the Wraith Killer, who in their past life would crush their victims along with and among the cars. If you look around the map, you will find pieces of Philip's victims hidden among the scrap, helping to build up this narrative. Evil Dead the game also has elements of this, such as the iconic cabin where you can hear Henrietta trapped beneath in the fruit cellar, but generally the game relies on prior knowledge of the franchise, maybe excluding people who are new to the world. Finally, VHS does a very good job of building up the worlds through its level design. Wart's level, for example, shows the facility the monster was tested and studied. You can see the central containment room where the monster broke free, along with various other nice touches throughout the level. Staging player space with environmental properties that can be interpreted as a meaningful whole, furthering the narrative of the game. Essentially, environmental set dressing can really bring the world and its narrative together. This can lead to helping build a strong sense of atmosphere. What I mean by atmosphere is the feeling that remains when the rest of the game shuts the hell up. I think this is why Dead by Daylight and Video Horror Society excel in terms of atmosphere. It might also help that for both there is a certain degree of stealth which in itself can help create tension. Evil Dead the game is far too combat heavy for this, but admittedly, hearing the demon growls when you're caught out alone can be quite spooky. Finally, there is the level design itself. What I mean by this is how the environment supports the gameplay. DBD is heavily focused on loops, survivors and killers running around the environment. Each level features specific tiles like the Killer Shack or various wall formations which can be played in different ways. Although the level is randomly generated to some extent, the tiles which are generated are excellent and fully support the core gameplay. Each realm also features static elements such as their main buildings which players know they can somewhat rely on. On top of this, as mentioned earlier, the graphic style actually helps in recognising and utilising the environment during these chases, making for a very solid design. Evil Dead has some interesting environmental layouts where some demons like the Necromancer can excel in specific locations, like placing the flutist indoors or atop a tower. Outside of this, the level design only really applies during the objective stages of the match where demons seek to defend. Aside from this, most of the game becomes open space hack and slash, and the level becomes more of a background to run through than an active part of the gameplay. VHS has a static, unchanging level layout which allows for some loops and gives the monster player obstacles to utilise when being hunted. It also provides nice corners and areas for teens to suddenly hide from view to make their escape from a chase. It also provides open spaced areas which can be utilised by teens to ambush the monster, as well as areas the monster can quickly duck into cover. A teen caught out alone is going to get hit. It can be somewhat repetitive but does lean towards the importance and necessity of teamwork in the game. Though as a result, sometimes the environment feels more like background than it does part of the game's design. Overall, I think Dead by Daylight does the best job of developing an in-game lore with the entity, original characters, and even brings in licensed characters in a way that fits into the overall world. Its level design also fully supports and complements the core mechanic of looping. Evil Dead relies heavily on people being knowledgeable of the world already, and most of what you learn about the characters is via dialogue when playing. Also, the levels only somewhat affect the gameplay, but often is just the background. VHS is still in closed beta and hasn't fully explored its lore yet, but the world building is already looking good with the killer specific maps. Dollmaster's Workshop is another excellent example of this, though the environment also can sometimes feel like background rather than really affecting the gameplay, especially when playing as a teen. But finding this lore can sometimes be something of a chore in itself, so let's discuss one of my favourite topics. Good design, when it's done well, becomes invisible. It's only when it's done poorly that we notice it. A good UI supports a good user experience, focusing on making it comfortable and enjoyable to engage with. UI is often how we understand and interact with a game. To help ensure good UX, UI should reflect on informational architecture. Information architecture is the practice of designing structures, so basically how we navigate through user interfaces. There are 8 principles of informational architecture, some of which apply more to web design, but some are highly applicable to all design. I think for now we should focus on choices and disclosure, else I will never finish this video. So to summarise these two, choice suggests that a greater number of options increases cognitive load and makes it more difficult for people to make decisions. Essentially, choice overload, like when struggling to pick what to watch on Netflix because there's too many options. Disclosure is the concept that we only want to show enough information to help people figure out what they'll find next. Basically, we can only process so much information at once, so an option should be direct and clear. So with this in mind, let's take a look at the game's main menus. Dead by Daylight recently updated their menu, simplifying it further. There is minimal options avoiding choice overload. It's also mostly clear what each button does, appealing to the idea of disclosure. Another advantage is you don't really have to click more than 3 times to find anything you need, so it's highly optimized. Its left alignment is well presented, but I will say the layout feels a little empty now. I'll use the rule of thirds to show what I mean. This suggests that the cross sections are where an audience's attention is mostly focused, so it's important to keep these visually stimulating. DBD's UI used to be more in the center and worked well enough, but generally I really like the slight adjustments made for the new main menu. Evil Dead the game actually has very similar UI layout, being left aligned. It also features limited choice, making it simple to navigate, minimal clicks to get to where you need to be, and it's very clear what each option does. I would argue, visually speaking, the background feels a little more filled out than DBD with the rule of thirds, but I think both have very good UIs for their respective main menus. Video Horror Society also favours the left aligned UI, but also splits some across the top of the screen, then some on the right hand side too, and then some in the bottom right corner. In total there is 16 different options spread across 4 different groups. There's a lot of choice, and I remember initially completely missing the character select option when first playing the game. Not all options are totally clear either. Movies might be better to be named something like challenges, for example. Visually speaking, the UI looks okay, if not a little complex in places. I think it's fair to say the menus here are the weakest and most complicated of the 3. But there is more to UI than just the menus. There is also the heads up display when playing the actual game. Before we do that, I also want to briefly explain Z pattern. This is the idea that an onlooker's eye starts in the top left and makes Z-like movements across the screen taking in information. So with this in mind, let's look at the game's HUDs. Dead by Daylight has adapted and altered its HUD a lot. The finalised version is actually very good. DBD is about chases and looping. It's about making conscious decisions and outwitting your opponent. With the most important sections of the screen based on the theory of Z pattern being the upper sections, the core UI elements are kept in the bottom left and bottom right of the screen. This allows the UI not to distract from the core gameplay when the chase is on. The generator progress and skill checks are kept to where the survivor's eye are mostly focused when not in chase, to avoid missing them, and ultimately fully supports the gameplay further. It does help that DBD is very simple at its core, so when playing you don't need that much information to actually play the game. Evil Dead the game is a little more complicated in this regard. For one, it has a larger environment requiring an entire map to look at. Also a minimap in the top left, as navigation is so important to the gameplay itself. Followed swiftly by the game's progress in terms of objectives, so players understand what stage they are at. Health status in the bottom left, much like DBD, so players can keep track of their teammates or their opponents. However, I would suggest it's very strange to have ammo in the bottom right. The amount of times I don't even realise my own gun isn't loaded is pretty bad. As a core part of the gameplay, maybe this would be better suited in the top right. Then there is an inventory as well, and it just feels like a lot. The demon UI is very similar, but instead of ammo, abilities can be found across the bottom of the screen. Overall, there is a lot of information on the HUD for Evil Dead, and it does what it can to present it all as clearly as possible. Finally, Video Horror Society features a very clean HUD. Across the top we have very clear objectives, much like the Evil Dead. Towards the bottom left, like DBD and Evil Dead, we have player health states, along with powers and ammo in the bottom right. Skill checks and rage meters being very central as well, making them easy to see. I would suggest there is maybe too many colours going on the left-sided character UI at times. Maybe the yellow injury states could be clearer as a result of less colours on the characters, but generally speaking it's a strong HUD. Overall, I think Dead by Daylight has the strongest UI, but it has had the most time to iterate through and improve upon it. I think it has the best menu and HUD combination with clear choice and disclosure being applied. To me, Evil Dead the game has equally good menus, but the weakest HUD simply because the game requires so much information, and I'm not sure if the layout is optimal yet. VHS has the opposite issue with the HUD actually being excellently presented in-game and maybe the best of the 3. The menus outside of this though are far too complicated and choice being a bit too overloading. So UI allows some communication with the game itself, but what about communication between the players? Dead by Daylight offers 2 primary ways for players to communicate: text and gameplay. There is the pre-game lobby for survivors to say hello to one another, and a post-game lobby where the killers and survivors can have some banter at the end as well. You can choose whether or not to engage in this, and in my experience, players are mostly civil to one another. though due to some toxic elements we're now blessed with a less than perfect censor, which at this point almost randomly blocks words. Then there is the gameplay, where people teabag and shake their heads, hit on hook, etc. This is generally less civil, but if someone is clicking a flashlight at me, they're not working on a generator, so works for me. But these are the main ways people communicate in the game. Evil Dead the game has two forms of communication as well, only really for the survivor players though, being in-game microphones and a ping system. In-game microphones are always risky. People can be pretty disgusting, so not something I overly like to use, but fortunately there is the ping system as well, which makes it easy to inform your team what you're up to. Having both options is nice because you don't have to engage in direct dialogue if you don't want to. The ping system is pretty good and for the most part means playing with randoms is possible. Video Horror Society also features in-game microphones and a ping system. The ping system is pretty useful, but I would argue that the game is quite reliant on microphones for teams to successfully defeat a good monster player. And being free to play, I am quite worried about how friendly the player base will end up being, with no real risk of being banned because you can just sign in with a new account. I think all three could learn from one another. Dead by Daylight would benefit greatly from a ping system like Evil Dead and VHS for their survivor gameplay, lessening the divide between solo queue and swift gameplay. Also, I personally love the text-based post-game chat in Dead by Daylight, and would also like to see this integrated into VHS and Evil Dead in some form. Now let's talk community. This is probably going to be the most uncomfortable and opinion-based section of the video, but it's something I want to talk about for the sake of the genre. Sometimes it's the loudest minority of players that do get the most attention, so let's give them the attention they want. I've spoken about both the positive and negative elements of the DBD community in some depth in past videos, and a lot of it applies to all video games, such as the concept of responsibility for others' fun, so I won't go into too much detail about that. DBD in my opinion is a casual horror game which shouldn't be taken too seriously, but since MMR has been introduced I have seen the player base become increasingly sweaty and sometimes downright mean to each other. There is also a very vocal minority that expresses their disdain for the game, and these are going to be the focus of this section. These are the players who I guess feel trapped by Dead by Daylight. They have a compulsion to play it but don't want to. So when a competitor is announced, they get very excited, and I personally saw this most clearly with the announcement of Video Horror Society. Many DBD personalities and players flocked and rejoiced at the second coming, and these quite negative personalities became the foundation of the VHS community, keen for a game to kill Dead by Daylight. I've seen players insulted and even YouTube videos made attacking others for not loving VHS enough. Since the 3-month downtime for VHS due to hacking, or more likely legal troubles with the name, this negativity has certainly lessened, but I honestly cannot remember the last time I was this put off by a game due to the player base. Maybe League of Legends, or maybe Undertale. But if you truly want a game to grow, you're going to have to let go of the bitterness you hold towards Dead by Daylight. Evil Dead the game's community seems pretty content on its own little island though, so I guess they win this round, but I really do not understand the hatred some people hold for a video game that they continue to play. It's very strange to me. Anyway, moving on, which one is the most fun? Evil Dead the game is fantastic. I love playing the demon role. I've had a lot of fun leveling up the necromancer and using the flutist to overwhelm and crush my opponents. I was a big fan of Resident Evil Resistance and this game has filled that hole for me. Evil Dead is an awesome series of films with excellent characters and a great world. The voice acting, the graphics and the gameplay are superb. Playing Survivor solo is not particularly fun for me, but if I have one single friend with me, it's a blast. Healing as Cheryl or tanking as Henry, I am in my element. Even when my car gets possessed and I stand there confused and stranded, I am still loving the game. Video Horror Society is a game that I struggle to love. The community initially put me off and I'd argue it's not the most friendly to newer players. A lack of MMR can leave you frustrated going up against top tier players and sometimes the game is a little slow, sometimes feeling like a mending simulator against a Legion player in DBD. Also, trying to find the Book of the Dead can be pretty miserable. But when you get a squad together and the communication is good, the immersion and cooperation can feel amazing. I've not managed to enjoy Monster just yet, but it could be, for me, the right monster hasn't been added yet. I think the game shows a lot of promise, but I feel like I'm not the game's target market, and it desperately needs more content and to come out of closed beta. So to me, they're all fun in their own way, but if I was going to pick one, I obviously pick Dead by Daylight. I have over 2,200 hours in the game, I stream it on Twitch most of the week, and I still find new ways to enjoy it. Getting frustrated with my teammates in solo queue, swiffing with my friends, or murdering survivors as the killer role. Everything about it I love. I genuinely think it's my favourite game of all time given how much I still enjoy it, and with the new updates every 3 months, there's always something new to look forward to. The variety of killers means I've found my place with Pig, Nemesis, and most recently the Dredge. It's far from perfect, but I kinda like that it's not perfect. To conclude, I believe competition is a good thing, and hopefully my breakdown shows there is much each of these games can learn from each other and improve, making them all better for us to enjoy. We're all part of the asymmetrical horror community, and there's no reason we shouldn't want all of these titles to succeed. I look forward to the genre continuing to grow and more titles on the horizon. Thank you for watching. Sorry if it was a little longer than usual, but it's quite a large topic. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe, leave a like, and maybe a comment. I'd love to know your thoughts. Have a great day, everyone.